It's the billion-pound question. Where's the money the Conservatives promised the DUP for its support at Westminster? Does it depend on the restoration of devolution? And if that's not achievable, will the money ever make its way out of the Treasury? Welcome to a new series of The View. Tonight, politics has returned from its summer break. Everyone is refreshed, reinvigorated and ready to make political progress. There are just the thorny issues of Brexit, an Irish Language Act, same-sex marriage and restoring devolution to deal with. And that last one could unlock a serious windfall. We sent Gareth Gordon to the cinema with just one question ringing in his ears.
Show me the money.
And we'll hear what the Conservatives and Labour think about the billion-pound bonus.
I think that it is right that money should be spent locally by locally accountable, locally informed politicians.
There's a growing sense of impatience here at Westminster at what appears to be a very unsatisfactory state of affairs.
Also tonight, with Stormont still in cold storage and the DUP and Sinn Féin struggling to find common ground, do the other main parties see any chance of devolution back on track? And making themselves at home in a new-look commentator's corner, two familiar faces in Professor Deirdre Heenan and Newton Emerson. Hello, a new series and a fresh look to The View, but the summer break certainly hasn't seen any obvious shift in political attitudes. A standoff continues over the Irish language and same-sex marriage, while the Brexit deadline looms over everything. The DUP has found itself in the spotlight and under scrutiny from the London media as it continues to support Theresa May's government with the promise of an extra £1 billion. But let's stop right there. Not a penny of the money has seen here as yet. Here's our political correspondent, Gareth Gordon.
Deal or no deal?
It was a big deal, a very big deal.
Spending power of almost £1.5 billion will be available to address the unique circumstances of Northern Ireland.
We're promised loads of money.
Bingo!
But nearly 3 months on, with our hospitals, schools and roads crying out for their share, there's still no sign, and claims the Treasury is digging in its heels refuse to go away.
You can't cut me out now, you hear? Not after what I've been through.
This week, the DUP issued a warning.
That's the safeguard, of course. If it's not there, then the deal's off.
Or in other words,
Show me the money.
of course, this is not the movies. And with all these plots and plot lines, there's no guarantee of a happy ending. According to this public finance expert, it's already too late to spend the portion of the money promised for the current financial year.
If you take support for broadband infrastructure or even the York Street interchange, while there may have been some work already done initially on those projects, there still needs to be a fair amount of work to do to actually bring it to the point where there's tenders and a procurement process to actually initiate those projects. So the likelihood of that happening in the next, between now and the end of March 2018 would be very slim, to be honest.
So we went to Westminster on the trail of the missing billion. This Conservative MP has just become a member of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee.
When you look at Northern Ireland and you see, the fact that it is doing its disadvantage compared to the rest of the UK, I think it's right and proper that Northern Ireland gets that extra investment. And yes, there's some nervousness and tensions about the deal with the Conservatives and the DUP. You know, I'm from an Irish Catholic background, my family are from the Southern Islands, and so I'm well aware of those tensions. And my job, I guess, going on to the Select Committee is to make sure that, we are accountable for that and that people feel it's a fair balance.
And as for Sammy Wilson's point,
I want to see that money sooner rather than later. We've promised it. Northern Ireland and the Assembly need that money to be able to make long-term plans, because even if they got the money tomorrow, that's going to take a while to filter through to communities, to projects, to the public sector, however they choose to spend it. And so they do need that money. We've promised it and it needs to be delivered.
But that's not the view of the Labour Party's main man in Northern Ireland.
It is the executive and the politicians on the ground in Northern Ireland who are best placed to determine where and how money should be spent, and that is why we should wait, ideally, until you got the exec back before you spend it. Equally, I think there is legitimacy in withholding that money in order to put some pressure on the parties. They should all want to do the deal so that they can spend that extra money on health and education and roads and infrastructure across Northern Ireland.
In other words, more confusion over the £1 billion, though this former principal clerk to the Stormont Finance Committee believes the money is coming, and soon.
Having signed a formal supply arrangement with the government, that can be avoided. I suppose the only development that might change that is if Theresa May is deposed, there's an election and Labour get in. I think that would change the whole thing completely. I don't think the £1 billion would be there anymore. But as I've taken the decision to go into an agreement with the DUP, I think within the next month or two, I would expect that some of that money will start to trickle through.
Thank you very much.
Gareth Gordon on the trail of the £1 billion payout. We did ask the Secretary of State, James Brokenshire, to join us on the programme tonight, but he declined, though I have been speaking to his opposite number, Owen Smith. I began by asking him about his comment that there is legitimacy in withholding the money in order to put pressure on the parties. Isn't that something of a cynical view, I wondered?
No, I don't think it's cynical at all. We want, irrespective of whether there's an extra £1 billion to be spent, there will always be money that is to be spent in Northern Ireland, greater or lesser sums, and that money will always be best spent by local politicians.
But you are happy to see that money, which is desperately needed money, I don't think anybody disagrees about that, used as a carrot, or perhaps more accurately, a stick, to encourage politicians here to do a deal on restoring devolution when it was previously not connected to that deal being
No,
done.
I don't think that's what I'm saying at all. What I am saying is that I think there is some understanding that that money is only going to be spent by local politicians. I think it is the current government who see that as part of the negotiations, and I think that it is right that money should be spent locally by locally accountable, locally informed politicians.
But that wasn't what was
clear.
said 3 months ago. It was never explained in those ways 3 months ago. It seems that the ground has shifted.
Well, it wasn't explained properly, and there hasn't been a lot of stuff explained about that money. We're not clear about exactly how this coordinating committee between the DUP and the Tory government is meant to work. There's been confusion as to whether that's only about coordinating votes at Westminster between the two parties, or whether it might be involved in allocating resources and determining where money is spent. And I do think that the government need to be clear about exactly what the role of the DUP would be if there isn't a devolved administration back up and running, if the executive can't be reformed, in spending that money.
OK, let's just say there isn't a deal, hypothetically. Local politicians can't get it together, they can't restore devolution. Who knows what happens in those circumstances? Are you saying that the £1 billion that everybody agrees is desperately needed in Northern Ireland shouldn't come to Northern Ireland?
No, that's not what I'm saying at all, because we clearly need to spend more money on health and education in particular. There's no problem with spending that extra money, but there is a simple distinction to be drawn between whether that money is best spent locally by locally accountable politicians, or whether it's best spent by direct room ministers.
OK, but you don't need an executive in place to pay for the York Street interchange.
No, and I think some of the infrastructural
So that money
stuff,
could be released now out of the £1 billion?
Some of the infrastructural stuff that needs to go ahead, yes, it could be. Yes, it could be.
But you're saying it shouldn't be?
No, I'm saying I think the Secretary of State, who is, of course, in charge at the moment and is trying to bring together this deal, sees as one of the potential levers that he has, and I think quite rightly, to try and get the parties to focus on the prize that there is in the event of...
One of the potential levers. That's the carrot or the stick that I asked you about a couple of minutes ago, and you said no.
And I said that is, I think, something that the Secretary of State currently sees as a way in which he can hold out to the parties the prospect of them being able to spend extra money and put in place the plans that they've drawn up before the Assembly.
Well, then is the Secretary of State not cynically
positive.
using the £1 billion as a carrot or a stick? That's what you've just said.
Well, I think we all know that what he wants is for that money to be spent by the parties here in a restored institution. But, you know, it's not for me to defend the Secretary of State, it's for him to.
Of course, while you're critical on the one hand of the relationship between the DUP and the Tories, the DUP propping up the Conservative administration in Westminster, there have been instances, haven't there, in the recent days where the DUP has sided with your party on issues like lifting the public sector pay gap and on tuition fees.
Well, one, I'm not sure I've been, as you put it, straightforwardly critical of the DUP deal with the Tories. It's just a fact of life that Theresa May made that poor decision to call the election, lost her majority and is now reliant on the DUP. And yesterday, as you say, we saw for the first time the DUP, they didn't actually end up voting because we didn't have a vote in the Commons.
But they sided with the Labour Party.
Well, I think they indicated, didn't they, privately, I'm not sure that I saw them say anything publicly, but they indicated that privately they wouldn't have been voting to keep the pay cap on public sector workers. I thought on the day when the Police Federation in Northern Ireland called for a raising of the cap, which I support, the Labour Party supports, it was, you know, shrewd politics by the DUP to row in behind us.
You referred earlier in this interview to the Secretary of State using the £1 billion as a lever in those devolution negotiations. Should the threat to reduce or take away entirely MLA's salaries be another lever that the Secretary of State uses in the near future, in your view?
Yes, and I think James Brokenshire was right to mention that in the speech he gave in Cambridge on Friday night. You know, in a previous era when I was involved, back in the last period when we had the devolved institutions in abeyance and were thinking about how we put them back up, that was something that a Labour Secretary of State threatened. People in Northern Ireland are cheesed off that MLAs draw a salary without being able to
should they be reduced or cut altogether?
I think they should be reduced in the first instance.
By how much?
I don't know.
Well, it was 30% that was talked about last time.
Well, maybe that's the right amount, but, you know, I think that's something that would need to be discussed. I don't think I've got a hard and fast figure. You know, the nature of the support that's required for MLAs, the nature of the job they've still got to do.
And should that happen straight away?
No, I think we need to wait until we get through this immediate period of negotiation. As I say, I think there is a short window now, 3 weeks or so, and if we get into October and there isn't a deal, then of course I would expect the Secretary of State now to be saying something about salaries alongside spelling out what he's going to do for the budgets.
OK, finally, on the issue of the ongoing Stormont talks, are you hearing anything at all that gives you cause to be optimistic that agreement between the DUP and Sinn Féin could be imminent?
Yes, I'm hearing from James Brokenshire and Simon Coveney, the Minister for Foreign Affairs in the South, that they are still optimistic about the prospect of a deal being done. I'm hearing from the parties, Sinn Féin and the DUP, that there has been positive engagement and progress in talks, and those talks have been more intensive than they've been previously. But I think we will all need to see the smaller parties in Northern Ireland, more importantly the people of Northern Ireland, will need to see that there is some tangible evidence of progress sooner rather than later. Otherwise people will start to lose faith with this and will feel that it isn't going to end well, and we could end up with the worst of all worlds, which would be a return to direct rule. I think that would be a real retrograde step, and I think James Brokenshire should do everything in his power. Frankly, he needs to do more to engage, I think, the Prime Minister. We need to see more engagement from the Conservative Party in trying to bring about a break to this deadlock, or we will end up with direct rule, and that will be a backward step for Northern Ireland.
The Shadow Secretary of State Owen Smith. Will I then turn to the former Conservative Attorney-General Dominic Grieve? Does he believe his colleague James Brokenshire is right to hold back the £1 billion in the absence of a deal to restore devolution?
The money is there to be spent for the benefit of the people of Northern Ireland, and for that to happen in the best possible way must require there to be an Assembly and an Executive. That's what we've all wanted to see happen, so I have no criticism of the way the Secretary of State's approached this.
In July, of course, we know a Conservative Party statement mentioned nothing at all about a timetable for releasing the money, nor the issue of needing parliamentary approval. Now, suddenly, there seems to be a link between the money coming and the restoration of devolution. Why the change?
I think it may well be that there's a growing sense of impatience here at Westminster at what appears to be a very unsatisfactory state of affairs. Northern Ireland needs governance, and the whole purpose of devolution is to allow that governance to take place in a way that's relevant to the local community. And that requires cooperation. So it's very depressing here, viewed from this side of the Irish Sea, to see a situation in which the parties are unable to come to an agreement on such an essential basic building block.
You think that the Secretary of State is using the £1 billion as leverage to encourage the local politicians to do a devolution deal, and you think that's perfectly reasonable?
I think the need for a devolution devolution to take place is so important that I'm not going to criticise the Secretary of State for using any levers that he might have in order to persuade the parties to do it.
But the need has been recognised by just about everybody. There are infrastructure issues, there are legacy issues that we don't need to go into detail about now. I think everybody agrees what they are. Shouldn't the money be released as soon as possible, whether or not there is a Stormont deal, as everybody believed would be the case 3 months ago?
I very much want to see a better infrastructure in Northern Ireland. There are a whole series of areas of Northern Ireland which could be improved as a result of this money. Equally, we're in a time of great financial stringency. The United Kingdom generally is experiencing that, and Northern Ireland has, on the whole, benefited better than most parts of the United Kingdom, and I hope will continue to. But I don't think it's unreasonable of the Secretary of State to say that if this money is going to be used, it was intended to be presented to an executive that would respond to the needs of the local community. Of course, at a later stage, he may change his mind if there's no deal and we have to have direct rule. But direct rule seems to everybody here to be an unsatisfactory outcome.
We heard from your colleague Maria Caulfield there, who says payment of the money is perfectly reasonable, but in her view it needs to be balanced across the UK. What do you think your constituents in Beaconsfield make of the current situation?
I think they're probably rather frustrated by it. Everybody in the United Kingdom has been pleased to see what happened as a result of the Good Friday Agreement, the setting up of the devolved institutions, and wants to see Northern Ireland progress. And the most important progress for Northern Ireland is actually having an executive which responds to the needs of the inhabitants, the citizens, and is able to deal with some of the economic, educational and other social problems that exist. That will take Northern Ireland forward to a much better place, and we have to do everything we can to achieve it. And as we have a union, which is important, those of us on this side of the Irish Sea who take an interest in these matters want to see that happen very much.
Just one final point, Mr Grieve, on the issue of the failure so far to restore devolution. After nearly 9 months of trying, do you think MLAs' salaries should be cut or perhaps withdrawn altogether if agreement isn't reached very soon?
The Secretary of State made pretty clear that that was something he was going to have to consider, and I think from the point of view of my constituents, if we get to a point where in fact it's quite clear that the institutions, both Assembly and Executive, can't operate, well then in those circumstances I think the justification for maintaining salaries disappears because they won't really have an effective role to play.
It's been down for 9 months already. They've tried, apparently, very hard to get it up and running again, so far without success. How much longer can they continue to be paid just under £50,000 a year for not sitting in Stormont, for not legislating for Northern Ireland?
I would have thought the time must be running out on this, but as I say, everybody wants to see the devolved institutions revived. It is important, and my impression from what I pick up from talking to people who live in Northern Ireland is that most people want to see it too. But that's an issue about the parties coming together and making some compromises over their differences, which is, I'm afraid, what happens in all politics. And we have to maintain governance on behalf of the people who have elected us. It's one of the really key things we have to do.
Dominic Grieve in Westminster. So as we've been discussing, Northern Ireland has effectively been without a devolved government for almost 9 months now. We're told private discussions between the DUP and Sinn Féin are continuing. We did ask them to come onto the programme tonight, but they both declined. Meanwhile, the three smaller parties have been watching the process from the sidelines. So how long can this current deadlock continue for? I'm joined now by Nicola Mallon, the new Deputy Leader of the SDLP, her alliance party opposite number Stephen Farry, and Doug Beattie from the Ulster Unionist Party. Welcome to the programme. Nicola Mallon, first of all, three significant figures there, all singing from the same song sheet on MLA's pay. First of all, James Brokenshire, Dominic Grieve, Owen Smith all agree if a deal to restore devolution isn't forthcoming very soon, then the payment of MLA's salaries needs to be looked at. Do you agree?
I do agree. I don't believe that anyone should be paid a salary for a job that they're not doing. As an MLA, yes, you undertake a significant amount of constituency work and advocacy work, and you're paid for that. But you're also paid for being a legislator, for sitting on a committee and for scrutinising legislation. If you're not performing that function, then you shouldn't be receiving a salary for it. It's as simple as that.
Is it right that the Secretary of State should use that as a lever, a carrot, a stick to try to encourage the parties to reach agreement?
Regardless of what the Secretary of State's view is on this, I think it's the fair thing. People who go to work, you know, they're paid for doing a salary. Imagine any other profession where someone was turning up and not doing part of the work and still expecting full remuneration from it. So I think it's fair and it's balanced, and it would be the right thing to do. OK, very quickly, you said exactly the same thing, almost verbatim, back in July. It's now the middle of September. How much longer do we keep going paying £49,500 a year? Well, I think that's a question. We are moving to a very limited time and a window now. We've got until the first week of October, the second week of October, before the Secretary of State needs to start moving legislation in respect of the budget. But we've been saying all along, a deal can be done. None of the issues that are on the table are insurmountable. It comes down to the will and the generosity of the two big parties. And to date, it's been very much a very closed two-party process. And certainly whether we have the restoration of the institutions or not comes down to both of them. OK, we'll talk a bit more about that specifically in a moment or two. But Doug Beattie, could you in all conscience continue to accept your salary of just under £50,000, let's say in the new year, if there's no restoration of devolution?
No, absolutely not. And I think I'm with Nicola on this one. I was elected to be a legislator, and that's the job I want to do, and I can't do, and it's not my fault that I can't do that, but the reality is I'm not, and I'm getting paid to do that, so it's an untenable position. I can't keep being paid for this, and my real concern lies with the constituents, all constituents from my area who voted for me or didn't vote for me, who it's my job to work for them. And my concern is for those people who I employ, who will also find themselves. And I think the thing is important for people to understand, Mark, is I'm just the same as everybody else. I have a mortgage, I have a car to run, I've got a family to keep, and I will have to look for other jobs as well in exactly the same way. So you know, we have to move on, and if they're going to stop our pay, stop the pay, and let's get moving on. OK, but you say in all conscience you couldn't continue to accept that salary, let's say in the new year, if devolution is not restored. But what do you actually do about that? I mean, if the Secretary of State doesn't reduce it or pull it entirely, you'll continue to be paid, and we'll continue going round in circles potentially. Well, I mean, that's... You're not going to walk away, are you? Well, you don't know what will happen. You've no idea what individuals are going to... No, I don't know, but what do you think you will do if you're still being paid for something that you don't think is reasonable? Part of my discussions are discussions with various different people about how I see myself in the community, my own personal integrity, and the fact that I'm getting paid for not doing my job. I still have to think about the family and the home that I run. So I have to look at that, and that's a decision that I'm going to have to make. I'm certainly not going to tell you what that decision is going to be here, but you're absolutely right. We all have to look at this, and we all have to look at this deeply and look to our conscience and decide what we have to do. Are you having the same job wrestling with your conscience, Stephen Farry?
Yes, I mean, this is incredibly challenging for us. I mean, I imagine the people of Northern Ireland are hugely frustrated with the situation. We, as MLAs, are very frustrated too, and it's important to bear in mind even the more difficult context today than was the situation in the early 2000s. Back then, we had a much more benign public expenditure situation. I mean, today we're still going through spending cuts, and on the back of this current ongoing crisis, I mean, we're seeing untold damage being done to our public services. Our economy is really being held back by this, and there are people who are losing their jobs or being denied fresh job opportunities due to the impasse. So it is untenable for us to be in a situation where we are being paid fully for a job that we're not able to do through no fault of our own. But we have to recognise that and be realistic. OK. Meantime,
you three represent parties that are on the sidelines looking in, and Nicola Mallon's already said, you know, this is primarily about the DUP and Sinn Féin doing a deal. How frustrating is it for you that you are on the outside looking in and you can't really influence what's happening inside those private meetings?
Well, I think it's incredibly frustrating, Mark. I mean, whenever I was asked to come on this, I literally asked, well, what am I going to say? What am I going to say that I didn't say 2 months ago? Because for us on the outside, nothing has changed. There's absolutely no movement whatsoever, and we're sitting here twiddling our thumbs waiting for the DUP and Sinn Féin to do a deal or not do a deal, and then hopefully include us in this. So for me personally and for our party, we're working on scraps and we're not having an input and we're not being able to give solutions, and that's where we find ourselves now. So nothing has changed since the last time I spoke.
Tonight, Nicola Mallon, the Secretary of State's been delivering a speech up at Queen's University, and we saw a little bit of it in our news just before this programme. He talked there about being on a glide path to greater influence from Westminster, effectively direct rule. I mean, I'm not quite sure what that means and quite sure where that leaves the rest of us, but do you have a clear flight path marked out at this stage as to what happens next?
No, I know what I would like to see happening. I would like to see the restoration of devolved government here. I would like to see ministers in place taking decisive action to deal with the crisis in our health service and in our education service and across our public sector. That's what I would like to see happening. As for the path beyond that, the SDLP has made it very clear that we do not and we will not accept going back to the days of direct rule with the British Tory government being propped up by the DUP, especially in the face of Brexit.
But that's what will happen if direct rule doesn't work. I mean, how are you going to stop that?
Well, in 2006, when there was Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair, they made it quite clear when we were in a difficult situation then that they were looking at joint stewardship, that they were looking at both governments, and I think the language was stepping up a gear when it comes to north-south relations.
James Brokenshire made it very clear last week that's not on the agenda. It's not going to happen.
Well, the Secretary of State has his view on that, but other parties, including our own, have made it very clear what we think should happen. But again, we're focused on, everybody calls it Plan A. We don't understand why we can't see the restoration of the institutions. We understand from the mood music that things are moving. We'll know in a couple of days whether this is just semantics and passing the buck when it comes to the blame game, or whether people are actually going to put their money where their mouth is.
Stephen Farry, how much longer can this drag on for?
I mean, we were saying back in the spring this can't drag on much longer.
We've passed multiple deadlines. We have,
and they're not even setting deadlines now, just general vague targets in terms of a restoration of the institutions. I mean, the amount of damage that has been done to our public service, our economy, is massive, and it is ongoing. And even a situation where the Secretary of State intervenes to put in place a budget doesn't sort the problem, because we have a crisis in terms of no governance. Now, I'm a devolutionist. I believe in power sharing. That's by far the best way forward, particularly bearing in mind that we are a divided society here in Northern Ireland. But if we cannot get the parties to agree on the way forward, then someone has to step in. Now, I'm not a fan of direct rule, but that may well be what has to come in place. But equally, I'm clear that direct rule in terms of what is a singular approach from a UK government, particularly one propped up by the DUP, is not tenable given the nature of our society. So there will have to be an Irish dimension. Now, people talking about joint authority, frankly, that's a straw man.
What about joint stewardship, which Nicola Mallon has just mentioned?
I think the role for the Irish government will be more of a consultative role, and that's pretty much in the spirit of where we were with the Iron Gorge Agreement, which was taken off the table by the Good Friday Agreement. But we have to revert back to those principles that have been established. So for us, it's being realistic, there will be an Irish dimension to direct rule, maybe not immediately, but that is inevitable. And people who are advocating that, particularly from a unionist background, have to understand that reality.
OK, meantime, of course, Nicola Mallon, civil servants at the Department for Infrastructure have decided that a new waste incinerator should be built in Mollusk. Is that a decision in line with where we are in terms of the governance of this place at the moment?
No, it's not. When my colleague Mark H. Durkan was the Environment Minister, he refused that application for the right reasons. A new minister took over and shifted the departmental position from one of opposition to neutrality, and I believe that the civil servants there took advantage of that minister in his position, but they're now taking advantage of the fact that there are no ministers or an executive in place.
Well, that's not necessarily how they would see it. And of course, there's been the Planning Appeals Commission has suggested that has ruled that the waste incinerator should be built.
Yes, the Planning Appeals Commission made a recommendation, and then a permanent secretary took it upon himself to issue an instruction and a decision that should have required ministerial approval, if not executive approval. And so serious is it that I have written to the head of the civil service, because I have concerns around the process of this, the justification, and certainly around the timing, the way that it's been rushed out the door.
But we know, of course, that the civil servants don't believe that that is the case, and that's why they took the decision they took.
Well, we'll see what the head of the civil service says in his response.
OK, do you think it was a reasonable decision or not?
Well, I don't think it was necessarily a reasonable decision, but here we are as politicians, and we're not in a position to make decisions. So here is a secretary who's had to make a decision, and he's made a decision, and it's difficult for us to criticise him when we can't get our act together to come up with an executive so that we can make the decisions for the people. So he's made the decision that he feels, with the information that he has, is the best. I don't agree with it, but I find it hard to criticise him. And I think we need to really start now, because these type of decisions are going to happen more and more. We're really going to have to start asking some really difficult questions. Do we need to start looking at voluntary coalition here to be able to move this forward? Do we need to have an assembly which is a body corporate to be able to move this forward? And until we have those difficult decisions, this is going to happen more and more.
Stephen Farry, in the absence of local political control, did the Permanent Secretary make the only decision he could in the circumstances?
Well, I think it's inevitable that permanent secretaries will be having to take decisions over the coming weeks. I mean, you can't go on, particularly in the context where very tight resources are available, not taking decisions. It was probably the wrong decision in the sense that you have 5 parties who wanted something else to happen, and that's a very strange and uncomfortable situation we find ourselves in.
But Mark, why can't the Permanent Secretary take a decision to lift the pay cap on public sector workers? They can't because there's no minister in place, but yet this Permanent Secretary was able to take a decision of this magnitude.
OK, so selective decision-making. You, of course, represent parties which have individuals sitting on the steering group for ARC21, which is the organisation pushing forward this. So on the one hand, there are members of your parties objecting to what's happened, and on the other hand, there seem to be members of your parties who are actually very happy about it, and in fact pushing it forward and making it happen.
I think because of the difficulty in terms of the contract and the legal situation that councils find themselves in, I think that's a different situation. What we have here is we've had a Permanent Secretary take a huge, monumental decision without any political authority. And I think that, and the fact that it's selective and contradictory is something we should be very concerned about.
Not just one civil servant, of course, several civil servants, and of course the Planning Appeals Commission as well. So we live in interesting times. Thank you all very much indeed for coming in to join us on the programme tonight. Quite a bit then to mull over with our commentators, Professor Deirdre Heenan and Newton Emerson, in their new crib. Welcome to you both. Nice to have you back on the programme. Let's talk about salaries, first of all. Newton, can you understand the logic of the politicians we heard from tonight who said that these salaries do need to be looked at, and sooner rather than later?
Yes, what I think you heard there was politicians under pressure from their constituents to say that, but as Doug Beattie was honest enough to say that that's not really how his family probably sees it. I think it's far too early at the moment to talk about cutting salaries seriously. There is
too early after 9 months.
There is still a prospect of a deal within the next month. So why do this now?
Oh, no,
and the idea of cutting salaries completely, people have to understand that is a very, very permanent move that will cause our political class to rapidly drift away, because they'll have to find another way to make a living.
No, I fundamentally disagree. I think it's time for the Secretary of State to grasp the nettle and start the process of cutting MLA's pay. It is just not acceptable to pay £1 million per month for something that isn't working, isn't functioning at a time when public services are facing unprecedented cuts. And I think the public confidence has plummeted in the whole process, and people are saying, why are salaries being paid when people are not turning up to work?
It's more like £90,000 a month, which is not a small amount, not a small amount of money.
No, it's not small. But
what that money is doing is keeping our political class in place, so that if there is a deal, there'll still be MLAs there to work it.
That's the point.
And also our political class, it seems, unable to show leadership, unable to come to a deal. I think we have to recognise that 3 of the parties at least had the decency to turn up here tonight. Others feel they don't need to turn up, they don't need to have discussions, and we have a Secretary of State who says he might cut the salaries. He's thinking about cutting the salaries. He's going to give consideration to cut the salaries. He needs to grasp the nettle and stand up.
The pressure he is coming under is from the public, the idea that the public resents this. But the public keeps voting for stalemate, so maybe the public should bear the cost of it.
OK, let's talk about the £1 billion then, which we've been promised. The DUP got as part of that deal with the Tories to keep Theresa May in Downing Street. Should that money be contingent on a deal being agreed?
Well, that's not what was discussed in the deal, so that's not how the deal works.
But it's how it's being spun now.
Well, obviously it would be good if they could use it to put a little bit of pressure on Stormont. But as the person you interviewed pointed out, time is running out for this year's part of that deal to be spent. There's a mini budget coming up in October. If Stormont isn't there, the Secretary of State will have to do it. He said he'll put that part of this year's money in that, and that's really the only point we'll need to start asking if this cheque has bounced. Okay, until then, it's just an academic question.
think it's reasonable at this stage, 3 months on, to move the goalposts?
Well, I think there's some confusion because at the start it seemed we didn't need an executive, now we do need an executive. The Shadow Secretary of State was just unwilling to give an answer as to whether or not we had to have an executive to give this money. I think the bigger issue, though, is the £1 billion. It would be churlish to say it's a bad thing, but it is not going to solve any of our problems by simply giving us an additional £1 billion. For example, health gets £5 billion a year and it is on an unprecedented mess. So the question is, how is the money going to be spent? How are we going to decide whether or not it's been effective? It's just throwing money at things and a sticking plaster solution.
Newton, a very quick final word, if you don't mind, on civil servants' decision to go ahead with this waste incinerator in Mollusk.
Yes,
can you understand how that decision was taken?
Yes, I can. It was extremely unfair to blame civil servants, and an individual in particular, for a decision. The last ministerial direction the civil servants at the Department of Infrastructure had was neutrality from their minister on the planning appeals verdict. So when that verdict came in, they had to accept it.
All right. Interesting indeed to hear your thoughts. Thanks very much indeed. That is it from The View for this week. Join me for Sunday Politics, 11:35 here on BBC One. For now, though, we leave you with the Tory MP Charles Walker, who has very definite ideas of how to keep his front bench in line. From all of us, bye-bye.
So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am no friend of the front bench. I thrash them and I lash them, thwack, 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 on a regular basis. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, have I broken with parliamentary convention? I'm not sure if I have, but if I have, let's put it before the Procedure Committee.
Oh, no, the honourable gentleman is being wonderfully dramatic. That is perfectly within parliamentary convention. Mr. Walker.
Politics is show business for ugly people, and I'm frustrated.
Speak for yourself.